Thank you so much again to my Ali Brashi, and it's now my immense pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Norman Foster. It's a wonderful transition because, of course, the future is often invented with fragments from the past, and this transition now of thinking about how the future of how the past of the city can help us is the future of the city brings us to a discussion we're going to have with Norman about the city and the future. Norman, of course, needs no introduction. You all know Norman also from, of course, the previous conversations in E.A.T we had with Philipp Ursprung and him, and we are so excited that Norman is back. It was actually virtual last time during the lockdown. It's our dream come true that Norman is here with us today in person here in Zurich. And of course, you all know that Norman is one of the greatest architects in the world, but there are so many other dimensions to Norman's practice. He is an institution builder, an inventor, very much like his friend Buckminster Fuller, an environmentalist, as we could see also in his brilliant contribution to the Serpent Science Back to Earth project. So many dimensions which we're going to discuss here in terms of form and impact. Please give Norman Foster a very warm welcome. And we're going to actually have a conversation with Norman for the first. Do I need the microphone? Yeah, that's better. Thank you, Daniel. We're going to have a conversation with Norman about the topic and some of the works relating to form and impact. And then after about 15 minutes, Regula Curti will join us, and we will have a conversation with Regula and Norman about the project which is becoming here in the Engadin, in Punt, and that will then complete the session. Norman, to begin with the beginning, you told me in a conversation we had some years ago in Martha's Vineyard when I asked you about Utopia, that you strive to make architecture a rewarding experience, to lift the spirits, and that as part of that, there are many themes kind of waving through your work. Sustainability as a powerful theme, the social agenda, and also the generation of new schools. And I wanted to begin with sustainability, and it's of course a topic, the topic of the environment, which has been in your work from the very beginning, since the very beginning of the 60s. So I wanted to maybe ask you to tell us about how these all began.
Well, I think the 1960s was really the birth of the green movement, although the idea of green as a label had not been invented then. So I think there were a number of circumstances that came together. You had Rachel Carson, who was writing in A Silent Spring about the effect of pesticides on ecosystems. You had the space program, the Apollo mission, the photograph Earth Rising, which showed, perhaps for the first time, a view of the planet and this razor-thin protective envelope. You had Stuart Brand, you had Buckminster Fuller writing a manual for Spaceship Earth. So the practice was born at that time, and it was a utopian vision of how did you find an architecture which related to these emerging challenges. So if we look at that time of projects for revitalizing an island in the Canaries, a new concept of ecotourism, so you were seeing solar cells, desalination of water, new agriculture. The patron at that time who was commissioning us was a very enlightened Norwegian, Fred Olsen. We did a project in what was then the London Docklands, is now Canary Wharf, and that created a low energy building with new materials, a social agenda, creating new standards for dockers who probably were at that time the most militant group because they literally would queue up in the morning for a day's work and were hired almost literally by the hour. So the practice was born with really a very powerful social agenda, an environmental agenda, at a time when it was really a fringe activity, and it's perhaps difficult to understand that so many decades later, where it's now mainstream. But at that time, it was very much a fringe.
And you told me earlier today that everything comes down really to design, but not only the design of buildings, but the design of cities. And in a text, actually, on the Norman Foster Institute website, you write that the future of our society is very much the future of our cities. And if we think about architecture and an impact architecture can have, it is, of course, and it's something we discussed when you and I were in conversation with Oscar Niemeyer many years ago. We went to Brazil to visit him, and that was very much the focus of that conversation, how one can actually have an impact through cities. Cities are the future.
Yes, I mean, cities generate 90% of global wealth. So a city like New York is equivalent in terms of its GDP to Canada. Los Angeles is the equivalent of Australia. So they generate wealth, they're about innovation, and at the same time, they're responsible for 70% of global emissions. And they're going to absorb the population growth of 2 billion by 2050. So how do we plan new cities? How do we adapt existing cities to these new challenges? And perhaps in the context of a town like Schwartz and this audience, one should perhaps say it's more than just cities, it's communities, it's urbanities. It could be a town, it could be a village. What sort of trends do we encourage? You could say simplistically, there are two kinds of communities stroke cities. There are those which are relatively new. They, up till quite recently, the city of the future was going to be totally bound up with the automobile. And it's perhaps no accident that a number of circumstances, whether in the United States, the Interstate Highways Act brought in by Eisenhower in the 50s, with a network of high-speed roads. And so the idea of the sprawling car-borne city, and the polar opposite of that is probably the community here. It's a city like Zurich. It is the traditional, compact, walkable city, which most likely has a historical core and then has a series of neighborhoods as constellations around that core, which are essentially walkable. Now, if you say, well, these are the two polar opposites, and of course there are hybrids in between. You can have a city which started traditionally and then has expanded over a highway network and started to sprawl into the countryside. So if you said, well, okay, how do we pull back? How do we take this out of an opinion, a view? Let's look at the data. So in terms of carbon footprint, the compact city wins out every time. Its footprint is about half that of the car-borne city. For example, there's two researchers from Berkeley quite recently did a map of the East Coast, and it's a color map based on household carbon. And high carbon is bright red through to orange, through to yellow, and absolute low carbon is dark green. And you look at this map, it's almost all red, yellow, orange, and there's a little dark green splodge, and that's Manhattan, because Manhattan has low car ownership, it's highly walkable, has a very, very efficient public transport, high density. And again, if you say, okay, let's move away from that, what is the market telling us? If we don't care about the planet, what do people want? Every survey that's been done of where people want to visit or live or bring up a family is in that walkable, high-density city on 3 continents. The top 10 are always that. If you said, all right, let's move that aside, what about health? Where do people live the longest? They live the longest in places where it's walkable, pedestrian friendly, because exercise is a key element. Also, loneliness is a killer. So the compact neighborhood-related city is healthier. Diet, of course, is the third one. And one could go then into the whole issue of urban farming, but that's another trek. And if we said, well, all right, put everything aside, what is the real challenge? The real challenge right now is probably clean energy and low carbon energy. And although it's highly controversial, nuclear statistically is the cleanest and it's the highest density energy. Nobody has died from nuclear waste, not one single person. But every year we spew into the atmosphere 40 billion tons of invisible gases, which kill up to, depending on the estimate, anything between 7 and 10 million people a year. So the compact city is also going to preserve, if we avoid covering it with wind turbines and solar cells, is going to preserve our nature, the very ecosystems that is the real challenge. So design, which will come down to individual buildings or objects, is totally encyclopedic in that respect. And it's all about decision making. And it's absolutely fascinating, the mismatch between what we know as data and what in many cases is government policy. And that last talk was with the very beautiful images of a neighborhood which was compact, which was dense, which was about community. If you look at what the Egyptian government is doing as a policy, and you look at the new Cairo, it's 8-lane highways. It's business districts which are like Canary Wharf, which is totally commercially orientated. It's not about neighborhoods. It's not about housing. And it's no wonder that now the leases are up, that's folding. And all the people from there are going, guess where? Back into the historic centre of the City of London, which is compact, which is dense, which is neighbourly, which is a mixed use.
Thank you so much. We wanted to also, before talking about La Punt, talk about, because we talked about the environmental dimension, but also the social dimension of your projects. And there is, of course, a project you're working in India, which started with Tata, where you basically work on neighborhoods, but also a project in Ukraine, which is very socially focused in Kharkiv. Could you talk about that?
Well, you're really talking about a number of cities just now, or communities. Yes, I wear kind of 3 hats. I'm involved, obviously. I founded a private practice which has grown over the years. So I chair that. I lead design. I also, as you say, involved with the foundation, which is very much about education, civic leaders of the future. And I'm the advocate for the Forum of Mayors for the United Nations. And it was in that role that I was approached by the mayor of Kharkiv, who said, I would like help to create Kharkiv, although it's in the middle of a war, as a city of the future. Could you help with regeneration, with making change for the future, to make it a city, an ideal city of the future? So that led us to initiate a master plan. And the start of that was, I brought a multidisciplinary team. I brought economists from Oxford University, from Harvard, connections into the World Bank, into financing, into economics, engineering through Arabs, our own team, which was architect-based, so a multidisciplinary team. And we've been working on a master plan with the community on a combination of something which is led from the top, so it's a civic initiative, it's entrepreneured by the mayor to bring in new industries and so on. But the development of that is a bottom-up. It's working with the community, it's identifying interest groups, working with them, questionnaires to try to determine the ambitions, the desires of citizens. And you mentioned India, and it's interesting. I mean, incidentally, many will say, well, how come that in the middle of a war that you're diverting, if you like, precious energy into the future of a city after the war? But of course, there are very good precedents for that. If you take London today, with its emphasis on neighborhoods, the protective green belt, which prevents that sprawl, keeps the city compact, mixture of uses, the importance of the high street, all of that came out of the Abercrombie plan, which was 1943-44. And if you look historically, those were the darkest days of World War II. So planning for the future has very good precedents. And if I move from a city like London or Ukraine, and I go into an informal settlement where we worked in Odisha with the proposition, which we proved, that an informal settlement which doesn't have access to electricity for heating and cooking, for clean water, for adequate shelter, that those are communities of hope, not communities of despair. And it was interesting in the project for a fishing, an informal settlement focused on fishing, that working with the local interest groups in exactly the same way as Ukraine, exactly the same way as London. When we close one side of Trafalgar Square, you identify the interest groups, the taxi drivers and so on. And in that bottom-up approach, find consensus. And in the case of the informal settlement, just over a year before it was terminated by COVID, we were able to achieve a transition to modern sanitation, to pave public spaces, regenerating a nursery school, bringing waste management, recycling, all of that into a community which is largely in officialdom, in official eyes, seen as something that really you should start bulldozing and relocate people. And of course, the social disruption and downsides of that are very well publicized.
Thank you so much, Norman. A big round of applause for Norman Foster.
Thank you.
And it's now my immense pleasure to introduce Regula Curti. I suggested Regula maybe sits here. A very warm welcome to Regula Curti. Hello, Regula. Regula, of course, has for a long time created spaces for people to enable consciousness, founded numerous organizations, the Sejau, that's a house of sacred arts, and also, of course, the project Beyond Music. And there is a wonderful connection, of course, also to yesterday with Alvaro Barrington, who talked a lot about Tina Turner. We had Andrew Hale's incredible performance in the evening related to Tina Turner. And of course, Tina Turner, whilst living in Switzerland, was really one of the closest friends of Regula Curti. And we want to talk today about Punt. And of course, it's somehow very connected to what Norman, you already told us about the importance of community. I was in Davos actually speaking to Rick and Yamamoto, who talked there about, in a way, architecture's most important task to build communities. And the project you're doing in Punt is such a project. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, it's of course, Norman, not the first time that you create such a community center. It began already in the 70s with an idea behind the open house in Wales. But this is a very specific community center here in the local context of the Engadin. And I wanted to ask you both how it all began. Maybe we can start with Regula.
Yes. It all began with a vision and a love for the valley. And it is Beat Curti, my husband, who unfortunately can't be here, who was the visionary, the first co-visionary for that project, because he wanted to give something back to the valley. The valley gave us so many years of beautiful vacations. And he wanted to give back to a community which has the tendency now to die because the young people, they don't find jobs, and too many tourists buy apartments, and it becomes a dead village. So he decided to change that, and was approaching you, Norman. It was in 2018, I think, when he did that. And that was the beginning for the third place we are going to build together with you this year. We will start.
Right.
So how was this first coming together with Beat?
Um, I remember it as a lunch at home, and there must have been about 30 or 40 people, and the dessert was everybody helped themselves in the kitchen, and Beat approached me and said that he'd been to the foundation, and that he was impressed when he saw the young scholars getting together with different groups, and that idea of cross-fertilization, and that was by way of introduction to the thinking that he and you and some of your colleagues had been exploring conversationally, about a kind of hub that would help to regenerate a rural community. And I think the issues of rural communities is quite a wide issue, one that you will find equivalents in America, in other countries, in Europe. You've got the industrialization of farming, it's less labor intensive. You've got shopping, which has changed from a local shop to a supermarket down the road. All of these forces and many others lead to younger people leaving. So that was really the start of a great conversation, and the architecture has evolved from that. So it starts with a need, with a social need, and then an act of patronage, which are enlightened individuals who see an opportunity to do something which is socially progressive. That team enlarges. Architects become involved through that, other disciplines, engineers, other inspirations. In the case of this building, it could be the snowscape, it could be the local vernacular. What do you learn from the local vernacular? And that's a very, very powerful influence. It goes almost without saying that the architecture of this region is truly unique. And if you take, by way of example, Le Corbusier, Ronchamp, that building could not have happened without his travels in this area. So environmentally, there are quite important lessons to learn. The way in which insulation, bringing many different activities under one roof. Then there are other influences, perhaps like Matthias Speicher, a Swiss artist, and his forms, which echo a lot of the snowscapes. So you put all this together, and here, interestingly, it really becomes an extension of the earlier conversation. It's very much about a community, about a neighborhood. So in this building, you're creating, attracting perhaps a new kind of working tourist. And within that umbrella of a building, at its heart, you're having the equivalent of the town square, the auditorium, which will bring people together, will bring a local community with a visiting community, where there's the opportunity to brainstorm a project, to bring in a local cafe, restaurant, in this case, overseen by the chef from the nearby Krona hotel. So it's really very much about a broader needs of a wider city-born community and how that can engage with the local community. So I think it's a great story.
Yeah, it's a really great story. And Regula, I remember a conversation we had with you and E.A.T some years ago here in the Engadin, where you told me that the project had also a lot to do with avoiding that young people leave the village in a way. And I also remember a conversation actually with Caspar Coppetti, and we of course had also David Aleman here at E.A.T from On, and they were also saying how important it is to kind of bring the digital into it. Can you talk a little bit more about that, the way how things are going to be combined?
Yeah. So together we are 7 co-founders, and Caspar Coppetti, our president, is on shoe entrepreneur, very successful, and he is local, and he has also the heart for La Punt. He lives there. Then we have Olivier Bernhard. He is a Swiss champion and world champion in duathlon and triathlon. So he is standing for excellency in sports. He will be also bringing that component into the division and into the InHub. And then we have Christian Wenger. He's a lawyer and very early, very engaged in Digital Switzerland. And he's also empowering lots of young people for startups. Then we have Jon Ernie, who is the bridge to the locals and to the local authorities, and he stands also for Digital Graubünden, for the canton, and it's very important for us too. And then we have Stephen Coltes, who is CVS Partners Group, our financial DNA. We need that. And then myself, been covering the approach, the holistic approach, let's say, physical and mental and spiritual health in the whole organization. And I also are involved in the hotellerie and the gastronomy because we own Krone, the bakery, and the restaurants nearby, and everything will become under one big roof of having 44 hotel rooms at the InHub, apartments, restaurants, big sport area for altitude training for professional sports, and also to combining for the people who are coming in the groups and individuals for co-working and co-creation, for innovation and transformation, all under the aspect of that we would like to empower people to find solutions for human and planetary health of our time right now. So we are a wonderful team, but nothing is happening without the community. So we have a very good relationship with our community and with the Gemeindepresident and Gemeinderat and the Gemeindeschreiber, everything which we need to really be able to realize that project. So we want to really work very close together with the locals and help them to also learn a new way of innovation in tourism. La Punt actually is a very important historical point. La Punt is a bridge, and the hammers came over the Alps, and they were meeting there from all directions, from the north, the south, the west, and the east. La Punt was the meeting point of global people to coming and meeting the locals. There were the merchants, the tradesmen. So this is another very important historical component because we invite global business people to come to La Punt and to find new solutions. So I was yesterday very touched by the cotton fields by Rick Lowe, because the cotton fields is something which vibrates also in me when I think about La Punt and the Engadin. We have the most gorgeous landscape and a very high energy. And myself, I work so well on this altitude, and we would like to share that with as many people as possible from all over the world.
Thank you, Regula. And this togetherness, of course, and that's maybe a question also brings us back to Norman, is something which is important in your architecture. And in a way, when we think about what you develop in Korea right now, a city within the city, there is a lot of kind of common spaces. Even an office building like the Bloomberg building in London is an office building where basically the community is invited. There's a whole road into the building which is public. And I think it's interesting because that was also a big topic in this kind of urbanism discussion at the WEF a few days ago, is this idea how actually maybe through the focus on the nuclear family, architecture has too much isolated people, and that is important to kind of break through that and create different forms of family. And it seems that with a project like Punt, that happens because there's going to be a lot of spaces where people who live there meet the people, who work there, meet the people from the village. And at the same time, it's not only that form of togetherness, but also companies who work there. Because we can think, I mean, even in office buildings where you have several companies, they are like nuclear families. They don't really, they're separated from each other. So can you maybe describe a little bit how architecture can go beyond that separation and how you're going to solve that in Punt?
I think really it's a fusion. It's a fusion of the philosophy behind those who create the building and those who design. So it's really dissolving, very much about dissolving barriers and boundaries. And it's interesting that the scale of Punt is very much of a village, and the scale of Bloomberg, which you mentioned as a building, which has several thousand individuals, and is the scale of the city. But the philosophy is very much the same. So a corporate headquarters, say like Google, goes into a city and it provides everything. And that seems absolutely amazing. You've got the hairdresser, you've got the gym, you've got the restaurant, the cafes, and it's all provided for the workforce, which is private. The result is that the community, the neighborhood around it, dies because the dry cleaning shop doesn't have any customers because the Google is providing that. An opposite philosophy, which is the Bloomberg one, is that you provide the social nucleus, something called the pantry, where everybody goes through. So if they work on the second floor, they have to go through the pantry on the 7th to get to the second. So that's where the buzz is, and that's where you can get a really good coffee, of fruit juice, whatever. But it stops short of providing all the other things. And the architecture creates an arcade. And within that arcade, there are restaurants, gyms, and part of the philosophy is to engage with the neighborhood and to encourage small businesses. So you encourage people to go out to the gym. And in a way, at a very, very small scale, what we're seeing here is bringing the street alive with a sports shop, with a cafe, with a restaurant, with spas. So it's an engagement with local traders, local community. And woven into this is a very powerful, sustainable agenda. So you have geothermal, you have solar PVs, very, very high insulation. It's a wooden building in terms of its structure and all its internal fittings. That wood is sourced locally here as larch. It's transformed into building components. It's installed, so there's no travel in between the orientation, the level of insulation, the amount of glazing. That, as I said earlier, is inspired by the example of the traditional architecture. So add all these things up, and it's a highly sustainable agenda. So everything in a holistic manner is working together.
That could not be a more wonderful conclusion. Thank you so much to Norman Foster, to Regula Curti. Big round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.